See filing trends by chapter in the state of Wyoming. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. This first chart shows total filings by year in the state since 1990. During that time, there have been about 42,000 cases filed there. In the early 1990s, filings were running around 12 to 1,500 per year. This kind of jumped up to around 2,000 per year by the late 1990s, and early 2000s around 2,500 per year. There's a big jump in surge in filings in 2005, the year of bankruptcy reform, followed by a nearly 80% drop the next year. Then filings rebounded back up to over 1,500, so about where they'd been in the early 1990s, but well below the years prior to bankruptcy reform, and then have dropped off quite a bit since then. So in 2015, filings were well below where they were in 1990, and most states were about the same as 1990, and only about a third or so where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. One other thing that is kind of interesting on this chart is this period from 2006 to 2008. Nationwide, filings went up 81% during that time, and in Wyoming, a very small increase, only 21%. I'm not sure why that happened. The only other state that had a similar pattern was during these 2 years was Montana, and I'm not sure really why filings didn't rebound in these two states compared to what happened everywhere else. This map shows filings relative to population over the period from 1990 to 2015. The red are the states that have the highest bankruptcy rate, more than 25% above the national average, and the perennial leader is Tennessee. Their rate is nearly double the national average. The yellows are states that have very low bankruptcy rates, and that's a lot of the Northeast, and the very lowest in the country has been Alaska. Wisconsin is a borderline yellow blue state in that their rate has been 24% below average over time. And looking at this year by year, the red is the national average and the blue is Wyoming. From 1990 to 2004, the bankruptcy rate in Wyoming averaged about 13% below the national average, where since 2006 to 2015, the gap is much wider. It's more like about 45% per year. So over time, the bankruptcy rate in Wyoming has fallen relative to what's gone on in the rest of the country. Now this chart shows filings, Chapter 7 filings in the state, and it's pretty much the same pattern as total filings. Early 1990s running 1,000, 1,300 per year. By the early 2000s, filings were a little over 2,000, around 2,200 per year. Spike in 2005, 80% drop, an increase through 2010, but not to the extent of most other places, and still well below where they were back in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. And then since then, there's been a drop, so that in 2015, filings were down, well below where they were in 1990. Most states were about the same, but in Wyoming, they're fairly below that, and down probably 60% from the years just prior to bankruptcy reform. Now, one thing about the Chapter 7 caseload in Wyoming is that it is more likely to be closed as an asset case, in that the trustee will collect and distribute some funds more than any other state. The national average, only 6 to 8% of cases end up as asset cases. In Wyoming, it's nearly 38%, and there's Montana and Idaho, Utah and Arizona are also very high on this figure. But in comparison, you can look at in California, less than 2% of cases, Chapter 7 cases, end up with any money being collected and distributed. And also, you can see on this that yellow would be the more in the average range, and there's almost no. There are almost no states where they have kind of an average rate of asset cases. They tend to be very high, like Wyoming and a number of the western states, or very low, like a good portion of the country. This chart shows Chapter 11 filings in Wyoming. And you can see that there's a big drop throughout the 1990s, and this happened pretty much everywhere nationwide. And then since then, generally 10 to 20 per year have been filed statewide, but even below that the last couple of years, and I think there'll only be about 5 filed again in 2016. So there has never been all that much Chapter 11 activity in Wyoming, and particularly very little right now. Looking at Chapter 13 filings in the state, you can see that most years the filings were between 100 and 150. There was an exception from 1996 and 1998 where filings really spiked, and this happened in a number of western states, but not all of them. It happened in Montana, Idaho, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, but I'm not sure why. And filings then kind of dropped off a little bit higher with the recession, and then the most recent, during the Great Recession, they peaked again, but then have fallen down quite a bit. And so right now you're looking, about 100 the last 2 years. 2016 looks like about the same. 100 to 120 will be filed, which is below where it was in 1990 and about half of where it was during these 2 peak periods. Looking at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13s, the national average has been running right around 30% for several decades. There's some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform, but generally most years are pretty close to 30%. In Wyoming, the rate has been from 1990 through 2005 was running in the 8 to 10% range most years, and since 2006 it's been in the 10 to 15% range, but still every year has been well below the national average, and it's the gap seems to be getting a little wider right now. This chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Wyoming since 2006 compared to the national average. It kind of gives a proxy for how the economy has gone, and you can see that most years the blue line here, Wyoming has been several percent below the national average, and during the Great Recession the rate peaked at about 7% in the state compared to nearly 10% nationwide, and then it's come down to around 4%, but then in the last year or so is actually spiked up and has been above the national average for the first time in at least 10 years. And so now it's somewhere between 5 and 6% in the state compared to a little under 5% nationwide. Bankruptcy filings peaked nationwide in the year ended September 2010, and since then filings are down by nearly half, by 49%. The biggest declines have been in most of New England. These red states have declines over 60%, and also in the Southwest, and particularly Nevada and California have had declines of at least 70% since 2010. The smallest declines have been generally in the Southeast. These states have a lot of Chapter 13 cases where the rate of decline has been below 40% in most of them. In Wyoming, the decline overall has been 43%, so a little bit below average. Looking at it quarter by quarter, in 2014, for some reason, the decline was larger in Wyoming than in other states. And then since then, we've had kind of an unclear pattern where, up, down, or unchanged, and so it's a little hard to tell where things might go. We can see that the national is the rate of decline is slowing down. So for a number of years, it had been between 10 and 15%, and in recent quarters, it's been more in the 5% range. One thing with Wyoming, since there aren't that many cases, it doesn't take very much of a change to really move this bar. When you're only getting, less than 200 cases per quarter. Looking in the first 6 months of the year, filings were down around 6% nationwide, which is much less than what it had been. On this map, the red are states that showed actual increases, and Wyoming had a less than 1% increase. So it was really just a couple of cases. The third quarter, there's a bigger increase, up around 20%. But if we looked at this chart, say 2 years ago, there wouldn't have been any red states. That basically everywhere filings would go down. Most of them would have been colored white, which were declines over 10%. But the declines are easing across the country, and about a dozen states, 12 to 15 states, will show increases in 2016, and I think in coming years even more, so that by 2018, I would expect that virtually every state would based on this coloring scheme, would be colored red. As far as the outlook, I think there will be nearly 1,000 cases filed this year in the state. Modest increases in the coming years. I don't think filings are likely to return to the 2,500 per year that were filed from 2001 to 2004 without a recession or major bankruptcy legislation. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in the state of Wyoming. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.